I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we're going to play with some tweed yarns that have multicolored neps. Here we have the, oh goodness, I'm going to mess up on the yarn lines. I'll have them linked below, but here we have Wool to Die For's multiple colored nep colorway with the neon neps. I believe this is like, my name is Neo, and this is just the original multicolored nep yarn. Both of these yarns are 85% superwash merino wool, 15% Donegal neps, and the neps in this yarn are yellow, blue, pink, and green, whereas the neps in the neon yarn are neon yellow, orange, maybe green, and pink, I think. Right off the bat, the yarns look different from one another. This one looks way more gray, then this one looks a lot more yellow. And part of that is because to have the neps in here, there's a little bit of these fibers that are spun through the yarn. And so there's like a little bit of blue and pink throughout the bare yarn color and a little bit of the neons through here. Now, if we compare these with just a standard bare yarn, you can see that this one is slightly more yellow than maybe what you would expect. But then the last fun thing today is if I bring over a black light, look at how this Neo yarn glows. These neps are fluorescent. The ones here are not, and you can see our bare yarn is not. I mean, you can see some brightness from the label, but just to show a baseline fluorescence wise, we have differences here. There aren't a lot of times that you go and are under a black light, so the fluorescence is a fun feature. But what about showing off these yarns to the best potential? And so I thought that today we'd play around with both of these yarn bases and dye them a very dark color, like a black, to get a lot of contrast with these neps here, maybe less contrast with these multicolored ones over here. But then we should also dye them with a brighter neon color, which honestly might give us more contrast with these darker neps and less contrast with the fluorescent neps. And then we may also dye some Stroll fingering weight yarn as well, just to have one more little control to see what the same amount of dye at the same depth of shade looks like on yarn with no neps versus with our neps. And I'm gonna dye the tweed yarns together, but the Stroll separate, because I've realized that the Stroll absorbs more dye when I've had it in the same pan as some other Wool to Die For yarns. And so for a better control, because I believe that these are milled probably similarly, I'm gonna have this one separate. Maybe I should also separate these two, but I don't want to, oh shoot, should I? Oh, I guess I will. If I'm going to bother doing a control, I should bother doing a control, right? Okay, we'll do it. I've just redone my entire setup for this video. It's okay. It's okay. I will have links to all the yarn bases down in the video description. I am a Knit Picks affiliate, so I will earn a commission if you make purchases through that link. I am not a Wool to Die For affiliate, but I still try to link to the yarns that I use in my videos because, well, if you want to play with the same yarn base, I want to make it easy for you to find that to play with yourself. However, if you'd like to support the content here on the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel, the biggest thing you can do is subscribe and turn on notifications. But you can also go and check out the ChemKnits Patreon or my Etsy shop, ChemKnits Creations, which is filled with hand-dyed yarn that has been featured in my videos. And I'll have links to all of that down in the video description as well. What I'm doing right now is adding removable nylon zip ties onto the yarn. I'm not going to need to label the yarn because each base is very visually different from each other. So I'm not going to need a label to tell me what was what in the end. But I am using greener zip ties for the greens and darker zip ties for the black, just because that's what I have and it makes sense to do that. The zip ties are really just a handy way to hold on to the yarn, and it helps me prevent tangles, and especially when the yarn is wet, and so it can be harder to, I don't know, find where like you can separate the skeins. But anyway, I'm gonna need to add more water into this container for sure, but I'm gonna pre-soak all the yarn in just some plain tap water for at least 30 minutes, probably longer. Here I have some more water. These are all yarn bases that absorb water pretty easily, so they don't need that long of a pre-soak. I could have added them dry, but the pre-soak isn't gonna hurt anything. And actually, now that things are wet, you can really see how yellow that Neo yarn is compared to the Stroll. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves so I could prepare our black dye. And using Dharma's True Black Acid dye, I measured out 2 grams of dye 3 times. So that way I could do 2 grams of dye per 100 grams of yarn, or a 2% depth of shade. This should give a very dark black, and even though I'm planning on setting up a cold process setup, since I want to dye 6 different skeins of yarn separately today, I don't know if all of this dye will absorb at my cold room temperature in the winter, but we'll see. I dissolved our dye in some hot tap water, not worrying about the final volume because we're going to add all of this dye onto our yarns. Okay, we got the shoeboxes out. Now, when I want to dye multiple skeins of yarn in their own dye bath, and so I want to make sure that each yarn has access to the same amount of dye, I sometimes will like to do a cold process setup. And so I'll be setting everything up at room temperature, letting it sit for a couple of days, and then steam setting. Now, I mentioned some concerns that I have with 2 grams of black dye on 100 grams of yarn. I know that that is an amount of dye that the yarn can absorb. I just don't know if it can absorb it while it's cold. And so if we need to, if there's significant amount of dye remaining in the containers, then we can decide, okay, we're gonna now kettle dye everything one at a time, but it might be okay. Now, another thing not helping us right now is the fact that it's winter and my house is cold. Especially where I leave the yarn to sit, it's cold. So that is just another thing worth considering. Now, it's not a problem and isn't gonna make a big difference in our comparisons if there is a smidge of dye that falls on the counter or is left behind in the cups. Because percentage-wise, most of the dye is in our containers. Okay, let's do the last one. So far in each of the containers, we have 8 cups of water, and we have no acid yet. This is to help us get nice coverage on the yarn. Oh, I'm gonna add some more water. Okay, and I've made a little bit of a mess. I'm gonna go rinse off my gloves so I can bring over our yarns and get things nice and messy again. Oh, now one perk of cold process can be, because we're slowing down the rates that the dyes will strike to the yarn by having no acid and with it being cold at first, it makes it a little easier to get more of a solid coverage on our yarn. However, 8 cups of water is not high volume, so if you really wanted to get more of a solid, I would recommend using a larger container and a larger volume of water and stirring more frequently than we will here. So you can end up with some decent tonal variation as well, but starting cold with no acid is the way to get the most even coverage on our yarn. Now, right now, our Neps are looking quite invisible. And that's because they have soaked up some black liquid like a sponge. But the Neps are acrylic or something, so they don't stain. They should not take up color in the end. It's just right now, it looks like you know, the yarn is just completely black. But I need to clean things up. Now, if it were spring or summer and it was gonna be above freezing outside, I would pop the lids on. Oh, we need acid still. But I'd let things sit outside. But since we're gonna let it sit inside, and because, as you see, maybe there's some spills on the countertop, I always set these on top of a brown paper bag. That way, if there is dye on the bottom, I can absorb it. Okay, I need acid. Let's go ahead and do 4, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Having more acid will help things. Now, with cold process, yeah, as I mentioned, I'm gonna let things sit for a couple of days. But then once their dye bath is clear, I will still heat set the yarn. And I do that just to have good confidence in the colors being well set. Mainly because I've had dye baths go clear and then washed it and had bleeding. And so the heat setting step is just something that I'm always going to do because I don't want to make a mess. But this is allowing me right now to set up 3 samples when I have 2 dye kettles. I have limited burners on my stove. And so it just lets me set things up side by side. And then I can spend a weekend day or an editing day heat setting everything. So it works out. And there is a little bit of dye on the sides, like at the top of the container, that's not down in sort of the dye bath area. And so for that reason also, we may have a tiny bit of dye left behind in the end, but I'm excited and I'm gonna set these aside and we can start working on our greens. For our greens, we have a combination of Jacquard Chartreuse and Dharma Radioactive. And that's because I don't think I have enough of the Chartreuse to do exactly what I would like to do. So I have about 60 milliliters of the Chartreuse. We're gonna have about 40 milliliters of the Radioactive to bring that up to 100 milliliters. But then to get everything ready to go, I'm gonna dilute the dyes. So that way I can divide it in 3 a little bit easier. And in the process, I'm gonna rinse out this container and our graduated cylinder. Because it's gonna be a lot easier to divide this dye in 3 if I have at least 300 milliliters of dye in this container. So that's what I'm gonna do. Okay, I'm gonna top this off with a little bit of water going slightly above 300. Because now, oh, I'm not above 300 yet. Thought I was, but I guess I'm not. Bring in some more liquid. If there's a little bit of dye left over, that's fine. But I'm going for approximately a 0.33% depth of shade, which means it will have about 1/3 of a gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn. It's just this mixture, and it made sense to dilute it a little bit rather than try to measure out 33 milliliters of the 100 that I have and maybe not have enough. This should be a little bit easier, assuming I did it right. And I have a tiny bit of dye left over. I'm actually gonna add this to a container of leftover dyes that I've been collecting. I could divide this further between the 3, but we'll save it for later. Okay, but now we can go set up some shoeboxes again so we can dye our bright neon. Okay, we have 8 cups of water. Gonna add our dye. There's a lot less dye this time. I guess a 1/6 of the amount, because we have half of the amount of dye total here than we had in one of our containers with our blacks. And I could have used more color, but we also didn't really need to. I think we'll have like a nice neon at this depth of shade. A lot of times with neon colors, I like to stick with a 1/2 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn. So this is a little bit less. And hue-wise, I'm curious to see how this turns out, because normally I prefer the neon green of Jacquard Chartreuse, especially compared to Dharma Radioactive, which is still a fun color. It's just more stomach acid-like, if that makes sense. But I think that this is still going to give us a really pretty, although less saturated slightly, neon green. The colors could break. And by break, I mean separate. So there isn't actually a fluorescent blue or green acid dye molecule. What we have are fluorescent yellow acid dye and then adding some blue pigment in. And so that's what gives us the fluorescent green. I think it's interesting right now that that one's immediately a lot more yellow, but also because we knew that the Neon Neps base is more yellow overall. And the thing is, if I feel like the colors aren't saturated enough, in the end, we can always add more dye, but we can't remove dye. Because right now, on our Neps yarns, it's not looking that saturated, which is why I'm really glad I have the stroll in here to show, like, hey, this is what our colors are looking like. But anyway, I bring over a black light. How funny, you can see the Neps in there a little bit. I mean, I don't know if it's showing up. Oh, it's showing up on camera. Less so interesting on the multi-Neps, but we know it's the same amount of dye in each one. But now it's time for some acid. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm so curious to see what the difference between the three bases will look like with the black and with the green. I mean, the green is, I'm doing a lighter color. I hope I didn't go too light. But again, when I lift the yarn up, not all the dye is in the yarn left yet. There's still dye in here. It's just, it doesn't look like there's that much dye left because it is like a brighter and therefore paler color. But we'll see. We'll see and decide if I wish I had dyed this again. Because again, I can add more dye to these three skeins and that would not be a problem. So I'm going to pop lids on these and set them aside again for a couple of days. It's a couple days later. And we're going to start with the green because I believe our green has absorbed. We have our Stroll, Neon, and Multi-Neps here. And I would say 99-point-something% of the color is in our yarn. We can't really compare them all until things are dry, just because sometimes things like the Neps or something can look different when wet versus dry. Now, things aren't super cold right now. I store them near a window that's a little bit cold when things are inside, but I'm going to seam set everything for 30 minutes and we'll look at the black yarns. Now, the blacks, it's funny because the green is definitely, the two greens are colors that take longer to absorb, whereas our black is a color that's easier to absorb, but we have a lot more of it. And so that is very little black left. That is our Multi-Neps. I know it looks, let me lift all three at once. It feels a little similar. So I have two choices here. I can kettle dye the yarn, which means that I can put it in to a dye bath and heat for 30 minutes. I have a feeling I might do something that is a combination because I was debating here and I was like, I could just steam set it and we could see how much color is left. It'll leave no dye behind. But I do want to see if we can get all the color to strike. So here we have like our neon, our multi, and our stroll. I'm going to transfer the yarn, which it's funny because I think that it'll pop more once things are dry, but look at that. You can see those neon Neps, even without me zooming in. I'm going to add all of this liquid in to the kettle. into the dye pot. I keep calling these pots a kettle, probably because yarn immersion dye like this, which you'll say is kettle dyed. But I don't know. Okay, and I'm gonna take this to the stove and we're gonna start heating it for 30 minutes or until all the dye has cleared. Okay, we're starting to heat it. And if all the dye clears after like 10 minutes, then I'll go ahead and transfer this into the steamer basket when it's open and add the next batch of yarn into this pot, just so that way I can make things a little faster. Now, you might argue, why cold process in the first place if you're gonna have to immersion dye like this? Normally I don't have to do this. Normally I'd be able to go steam set like I do with the green. I just used a lot more dye here. And since the yarn had to sit at room temperature, which I keep the house at like 66 in the winter, since I have it at room temperature inside versus outside in the sun where it can warm up a little more, then, you know, we didn't get it all. Now, if I wasn't doing a side-by-side-by-side experiment, then I might take this and just steam set it and leave that little bit of dye behind. But because we're trying to compare the final depths of shade, I'm going to try to absorb as much of it as I possibly can. Okay, the timer went off on the other container. It's only been hot over here for like 10 minutes. There is very, very little color left. Yeah, at this point, I feel like I'd be okay to pop it into the steamer basket. Well, let's go remove the green yarn first. I'm not even removing the camera position. But I can take out the green yarn, and I can say for sure that the darker multi-Neps, the non-neon Neps, looks very different. So I'm going to remove that, and then the neon Nep yarn I just showed you, I'm going to remove from that steamer basket, pop in here. This is what our dye bath looks like now, and it is very, very clear. Maybe there's like a little bit of some black around the edge, and like barely any. I guess before I even come in with the next yarn, I removed the yarn first, and here's what that dye bath looked like. I'm combining it right now. I don't think I'd be able to do that for the third because the volume in this pot is a little too big. But the pH is going to be the same. It's just the dye is diluted a little bit more. And so I'll heat this until it gets hot and until the dye bath clears. My guess is it'll take around 10-15 minutes. It's just helping me cycle things a little faster. And 30 minutes isn't like a magical number, but it's one that I've found works well. It's easy to remember, and so that's why I stick with it. Okay. Here is our multi-Neps. The water's basically clear. I think it's not showing up on camera. I'm seeing a tiny bit of some like yellow. But it's not enough to really make a difference because I'm going to try adding our last bit of water in here. It's going to get pretty full. But the perk of this is that the water is already warm, and so then it'll take less time to heat up. And this one is our stroll. And again, I'm not needing to add more acid because we've already got acid in our yarn, and so that is ready to go. And the other yarn I popped in the steamer basket. I don't know quite how long it took, but we'll keep an eye on things. It was under 30 minutes for sure, and there's no harm in yarn sitting in the steamer basket for longer than 30 minutes. That won't cause any problems, but when I notice that it's clear, then I transfer. Okay, this one I let go. Oh, zip tie broke a full 30 minutes in the dye pot. This is our stroll. I turned off the heat. I'm going to set this aside so it can cool completely so we can wash it. And then as for our yarn in the steamer basket, we can also remove these. I just turned off the heat. Here. But look at how much the neon is popping. The other multicolored Neps, they're not popping as much. There's not as much contrast. I'm so excited to see all this yarn dry. There we go. You can see those other Neps. It's just, there's more contrast with the neon. Oh, I'm so excited. Okay, gonna let everything cool so we can wash it. Let's start with washing the black yarn. Oh, I forgot I needed a new zip tie. Okay, so if a zip tie falls off and you have your yarn and you're afraid of it being tangled, okay, what you should do is look for one of the manufacturer's ties. And then even if you can't, you think you might be holding too much, just check the direction the yarn is going. I think I have it. But even if you put a zip tie on, just to temporarily hold it until it's dry and you can untangle properly, then that can help. Okay, but now we can wash our yarn. And you can see why I like having a zip tie on here is because when it comes to raising and lowering the yarn, the zip ties make it easy to do that. Now, that is a very good sign. Oh man, because there's water left in the dye baths. I'm a little nervous that there could be some bleeding here. But let's fill this up. And I had just added some clear dish soap. The only reason why the clear matters is that way if we see anything in the water, we know it wasn't the soap. Otherwise, like blue Dawn wouldn't be a problem. Now, I honestly can't tell if there's anything, but given how dark the yarn is, I don't think that we have any bleeding, which is wonderful. And especially if you consider that there is so much pigment in the black dye, probably more than a lot of other colors. There's probably no filler in here at all. So we had a lot of dye. Now I am washing the yarn on cold, and it's January in Massachusetts. It's almost too cold to have my hands in there. So I'm actually gonna warm it up a little bit before we wash our greens. But oh, look at those neons. All right, I'm gonna put this through the spin dryer, hang it up to dry, and let's wash our next yarn. Here with the greens, and I'm using fresh water because I'm being absolutely paranoid. I don't want there to be any transfer. Okay, this water is still way too cold to keep my hands in. Oh my gosh. Oh, I'm not often very cold, but okay, that's manageable. Still cold, but not warm. Not too cold. Now the reason why you want to wash your yarn in cold water is because washing acid dyed yarn in hot water can cause color bleeding. It can disrupt the interactions between the dyes and the yarn, and maybe there's like a tiny hint of something in there, but again, not bad. Now, unlike the black, which right off the bat, the black yarns look very similar. I think they'll look more different tomorrow once everything is dry. But here we see three quite different colors with the green, even while it is wet. And this is actually really fun because I don't think, I mean, certainly I've compared each of the multi-Neps with Stroll, and I've done a similar colorway on the neon and non-neon Neps before, but this is really highlighting that difference. But anyway, I'm gonna put the yarn through the spin dryer, hang it up to dry, and we'll do a proper comparison on the dry yarn. Here's all the yarn, and I think that when I was planning out this project, I didn't consider some of the impact it would have on me with comparing these bases. And in retrospect, these things make sense, but it's really fun to see. But before I go into the nitty-gritty, we gotta do it. We gotta bring in that black light. And so obviously our greens are all fluorescent. And then on the blacks, you can see those neon neps pop in the most beautiful, beautiful way. Oh, that always just is so fun. Looking at just the greens, we have the multi-neps, the neon neps, and then just stroll. And I'm so glad that I dyed each of them in their own batch versus dyeing all three together, because we know that each skein had the exact same amount of dye. And so these differences that we're seeing are from those colors in the bare yarn showing through, because we have a very bright color. It's not pastel, it's a neon color, but it presents as, I guess, the most true on stroll. Here it's a little bit more yellow because of that yellow undercurrent running through. And then here on the multi-neps, it's more muted. It's more apple versus neon green. And that's because of the neps and those colors kind of going through the yarn. Here's a close-up on the multi-neps and the neon neps. Maybe once they're twisted, I'll be able to come even closer, but both of them are very visible on the yarn. Certainly the neon is more subtle, but because there's a lot of different neon colors in here, like the greens themselves have very minimal contrast, the other colors are showing up in a very fun, bright, party way. And so I think I'm going to be less afraid to dye this base with neon colors in the future. We have more contrast here with these deeper colors. And so the yarns feel very different. Here's a close-up of one of those neon green neps. They're still visible, just very, very low contrast. When we come over to our black yarns, and I still feel like I'm a little overexposed, maybe that's better. The neon neps here have a ton of contrast with the stroll and with the multi-neps. And I think that it's worth noting that there is a ton of that green and yellow color in here. And so really on the green skein, we're only seeing that orange and pink. The other colors mostly disappear. Now these multicolored neps still show up really nicely. I don't think that they absorbed any dye because the colors are just more muted to begin with. It's just the difference between those colors in the background is way more subtle, and so they don't pop as much as, say, those neon ones do. Now I have these three yarns in the same order that I had the greens, but when the greens, there was like a progression of bright to dark. Here we see the deepest black is definitely our stroll. After that, it's the multi-neps followed by these neon ones. And again, that's because this base felt grayer overall. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to get some good B-roll where we can feel the heathering in these tweed yarns. Because in order for the neps to stay in, and some of them do fall out, there are some strands of it spun in throughout the entire yarn that just kind of holds them in place. And so that changes the color of the bare yarn. And since that is probably an acrylic and doesn't take up acid dyes, therefore the yarn isn't going to feel as dark because we have that other color in there. And for comparison, a close-up of stroll. I was mentioning fallout. Some of the little neps do come off, and here they are sticking to the stroll. But yeah, the stroll is a very deep color, but there's still tonal variation in here, which I love. I really came into this video wanting to dye our multicolored nep yarn with either a color that would give high contrast or maybe less contrast, specifically with the neon, but I also brought in the other multicolored nep yarn just so that way we could see the differences. And we ended up with a really good video that shows how the same depth of shade on different yarn bases can look very different. And this isn't a case, because I've done this a lot, where we've looked at silk blends versus superwash merino, and that, yes, has an extreme difference. But these yarn bases are all 75 to 85% superwash merino, and that 15% difference of the nylon versus the neps, where the nylon can absorb the dye because nylon has a similar chemical structure to proteins, and so nylon is a synthetic fiber that can bind to acid dyes. I just find that this is a really good example for depth of shade. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I really hope that you've enjoyed this video. And I have to do it one more time. Bring in that black light, because actually, one thing now, obviously the neon Neps stand out here on the black bases, but the non-neon Neps on the neon base stand out as like black dots, and that contrast is so cool. Oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that. As I was filming these conclusions, I also filmed some shorts where I started talking about the depth of shade. And really, I mean, they're things that we talked about in this video, but it's worth saying. The depth of shade is the numerical representation of how much dye is on your yarn, where 1% depth of shade is 1 gram of dye on 100 grams of yarn. And here, where we have 2 grams of dye per skein, so a 2% depth of shade, again, this is darker than this one. And so if we wanted to, I don't know if we would be able to get this base to be as dark as this black, but say we wanted to get this black to be a little bit lighter, more similar to that base, we would need to use less dye and edit our recipe. And so that depth of shade isn't an absolute reference to the saturation of a color. You would use it to talk about how you might change the difference between a 2% and a 1.5% depth of shade on this base. And then you might talk about how a certain depth of shade on here is more equivalent to the specific depth of shade here. So just remember that you're comparing one yarn base to itself. But anyway, I have more extreme examples of that. I have a whole FAQ playlist where I have some longer form videos and some shorts that I think help clarify questions that I get a lot in the comments. And so if you have anything that you think would be great to address in short form for my FAQ playlist, please let me know and I'll try to make it happen. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Thank you so much for watching.